Peace and blessings, family. This is your brother Asarimhotep with the Madhu Mandela Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture. Today is Tuesday, September the 15th, 2020, and we have a very special guest with us, Claudette Smith-Brown, who's a genealogist, who's going to give us some insight into genealogy and, first steps in getting that process done. So it's going to be a very powerful show, and I thank you for joining us. So we'll be back in just a moment. And we are back, and want to again thank everyone for joining the live conversation. Today, we appreciate each and every one of you who are listening live, and of course, those of you who are catching the archives from New York City, Philadelphia, to H-Town, to LA, and those who are overseas showing love out in London and the Gambia, South Africa, and the like. We appreciate you all. And as always, I'd like to give a shout out to those who make themselves known in our chat rooms. So peace and blessings to Brother Robert Rand, Sister Tamika, Sunjiata, Atta in Zambi, BK Soul Farm, if I'm saying that correctly, and Sandra Grocer. And I'll shout out, others who make themselves known a little later. As discussed in the beginning, we have a very special guest with us who is going to give us some insights into genealogy and its importance to our everyday life, to our culture and customs, and the like. And so before I bring her on, I want to remind everyone to please like the video at the bottom and share the video with your friends on YouTube. YouTube works kind of like social media now. So on YouTube, as well as, of course, your Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or whatnot. Get your friends and family involved in the conversation, and all will be well in Zamunda. So, second order of business, I want to remind everyone that I do have a Patreon page, patreon.com/asarimhotep. And this will be the page, one of the main pages that I will use to fundraise to create the film Chiena Into, which will talk about the relationship between ancient Egypt and modern Bantu cultures of Central, East, and South Africa. That will be the volume 1. Volume 2 will be dealing with that which is in terms of the relationship between ancient Egypt and West Africa. And so, two powerful films we envision here. And so if you would like and are able to help in that endeavor, it would be we would be very grateful, and eternally appreciative. So, there are many perks to signing up to the Patreon, which includes exclusive content and early content. And so there are certain videos and interviews of individuals who, that are currently up, but is not up for the public. And so you get first dibs on all of that. There are certain gifts depending on what level that you pledge to. And you'll get behind the scenes and some other insights and free giveaways and all of that good stuff. So it pays to be a part of the Patreon team. So again, that address is patreon.com/asarimhotep. So you will be hearing more and more about the upcoming film project and its progress, over the next couple of years. The first initial, 2 years will be dealing with the fundraising aspect, but we'll be doing some of the shooting within that time as well. So I thank all of the Patreon members who have already signed up and have contributed. And I'm thanking all of you future Patreon members, in the future. So I am King Sosa. Peace to you. Peace to Inherit Kalfani. Thank you for joining the conversation. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our guest, Sister Iya Claudette Smith-Brown. How are you this evening?
I'm fine, Barbara. How are you?
I am well. I am well. I am well. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to, converse and share your knowledge and wisdom with my viewing audience. I and they are very grateful. And this is an important topic that is kind of not really talked about much, in our family circles. And I think that, this needs to be a practice, for everyone, even if we have to designate, every generation, someone be that person to, continue that record keeping and things. So what we're talking about today is, genealogy and what should we do to get started and all of that. But before we get there, since you are new to our program, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from and what got you into doing genealogy and helping people, with that as a service?
I'm a native of New Orleans, and it was interesting in my own family and trying to understand the dynamics of things that were going on throughout the family and see where it was coming from. And the more I got into dealing with my African spirituality and understanding the importance of ancestors, the more I knew I needed to do this research and go back in my bloodline. I was born knowing both my sets of my grandparents, and my grandfather paternal was born in 1864. And I grew up around him, and I knew my great-grandmother on my mom's side, and she was supposedly Native American. But that's about all I had in the family, and nobody in the family had any contributions to add because they seemed not to know a lot about their past. So that's what started me on my journey. It made me go back to school and get a bachelor's in history so I could understand better what was going on during those times and know where to look for information. And so I have a bachelor's in history and a master's in history and a master's in museum studies.
And what kinds of things, without necessarily getting into your personal business, like what sorts of things were revealed to you as a result of engaging in that process? Like, how did it feel to uncover, the knowledge of certain relatives? Like, what did it do for you personally when you was able to get that information as you were working your own family history?
Well, it enables you to better understand things going on in your bloodline today. On one side of my family, there are Irish ties. On the other side of my family, I never knew what it was. Um,
Mhm.
I was fortunate enough that when I started digging, and I started out first doing something for the ancestors to
Mhm.
ask them to open the way. And I was able on my mother's father's side to go back to the actual slave sale and slave papers. And that's Virginia. And that whole thing ties into the history of when Virginia stopped tobacco farming and brought slaves into the South, into Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas, and the connections between Southeast Texas and Southwest Louisiana, because that's all the same bloodlines and the same slave masters. So it enables you to go through the general history and see how your personal stories fit in or don't fit into that general history that's being promoted.
Mhm. Indeed. And at the beginning of uh, your intro, you mentioned, the importance or the relationship to ancestors and, African spirituality. Can you give us a little insight on that relationship? Why is that knowledge of ancestors, saying so important from an African spirituality context?
Well, from my understanding and how I was taught, the ancestors return. So it's a continual flow of people in your particular bloodline. And not everyone in your bloodline gets ancestor status. All the deceased in your bloodline do not necessarily become ancestors. Uh,
Hmm.
that disconnect that came with us in the Americas because of the enslavement process is a real issue that we have to deal with in terms of spirituality. So that part of it itself was very important to understand who could be called to come back and who should be left where they were because of the energy and all that brought them into your bloodline in the first place. And even though they are not ancestors, a lot of their baggage is what a lot of our people are working through.
Hmm.
Because within that DNA carries all of the markers for a lot of things. And we still, I don't think, understand as a spiritual people how much of our dysfunction is coming from our spiritual life as opposed to our physical life.
Hmm. Indeed. So essentially, what is important in this particular conversation is that, if you're going through certain struggles and things, besides wondering how you got here in this particular space and time, the knowledge of one's ancestors helps to put it in context. And let's assume, for example, there's, I guess, what they would call generational curses. With you having that background, you can make the necessary steps to,
Right,
kind of end that cycle for the generations to come.
right, right. Because that's what we're here to do. We're here to resolve some issues from our past and put things on a better footing for the offspring in the future.
Mhm.
So having that genealogy knowledge gives you an opportunity then to go and do spiritual work if that's what's needed. Or to just sit down and figure out what these people went through and how they went through it. Um, it is very important that we understand our past because it's not just a proverb that if you don't understand your past, you won't understand your present or your future. It's the truth. And with all things being connected, okay, as African people see it, it's very important that we look at all these different aspects of our past and how they have impacted our present and things that have happened to us.
Hmm. Indeed, indeed. Now, I imagine, it's not like in traditional Africa where, you know, certain, our society wasn't interrupted at that particular time where you can just, it's part of the everyday culture to know and to understand your lineage going back, as far as, on average, I guess like 7 generations, you
Right.
know. So, here being in the United States, as a result of the transatlantic slave holocaust, that has presented a number of issues, when trying to trace, one's family. And especially, of course, with the knowledge of ultimately where our lines come from in Africa. So what are some of the roadblocks and challenges that, most of us will probably come across when trying to trace our genealogy here in the United States that we should expect?
Our first challenge is financial, the ability to have time to travel, and the fact that none of these records are centralized, except for the ones that have been put online and databased. And we have to remember too that humans were the ones that did the entry, so there are errors.
Hmm.
We per se do not have all the keyword needed to know where to go to look for information because it's not centralized in any one place on the internet either. And it takes knowing certain words to be able to pull up certain research. So for us as a whole, because genealogy is not an area we have always been involved in. We usually do not know where to go to look for what. And sometimes we don't understand what information is saying when we find it. Because it takes more than just surface research to be able to interpret some of these documents and all. What do certain terms mean during certain time periods versus what those terms mean now? What information is in what records during what period? Every census that was taken asked different questions. And if you don't know how they interpreted our answers, then a lot of times we are misreading what the census is actually saying. If you don't understand the culture during those times, you don't understand the information you're looking at. You don't understand the terms. You don't understand how in Black culture at one time you didn't have to be a family member to be a member of a household, because we took on borders, we did this, we did that. So it's the historical knowledge added to the documents that allows you to go through and try and make sense of things and not to take a value judgment on the information you found when socially it seems to conflict with what we've been told or what we know to be true today. And that for a lot of us is a problem is we are emotionally invested in the research. And sometimes we don't like what we find. But you can't put a value judgment on what those people had to do back then to survive.
Can you give us an example of something like that in which like some information that, we probably would not like that probably would come up, in that research that is, kind of common that many people may not realize?
You may have thought that your foreparents were married and had offspring, and they didn't. They weren't married. You may have thought folks in your family who you thought were siblings are not actually your siblings. They might be relatives because the culture back then was we didn't have orphanages. So anybody that had a child, and we didn't have abortions. So anybody that had a child, some family member raised that child as though that child was theirs. So there are people out there who think certain people are their sisters and brothers, and they're actually not by blood. They are by household.
Uh,
And we tend to put value judgments on how people lived back then based on what we have been taught in this society is the norm or right or wrong. And you have to understand the circumstances back there were not the same as they are here.
hmm. That's interesting to know. I know another area that may upset some people is, if they find out that, well, one, that they don't have Indian in their family, which is a rumor that's, has permeated through all of African American culture at all times. But if there is in fact a European, more likely a male along the line, if that doesn't come up through, DNA tests, and we'll get into, how DNA plays into the role, if you're, familiar with that. But or like I think of if certain people, and I know this would be the minority, if certain African Americans actually owned enslaved Africans, and trying to understand the context for that in certain areas, of history. Have you come across, any of that type of findings in, in helping anybody, trace their history?
No, I haven't run into that personally, but if you understand during that time, slavery was the institution in place in the society. You were either free or enslaved. There was no in between status. So blacks owned other blacks for multiple reasons. And you would really have to research that lineage to understand if that was someone buying someone free, buying someone that was enslaved to get them out of enslavement and into a safer situation, or if that was just a black capitalist who had a plantation and needed a labor force also. You can't know that without getting deeper into the research on the individuals you're looking for. And it plays out a lot when you look at New Orleans history and the history of the Court of Afrique. Those were free men of color plantation owners, okay, who went to war with the Confederacy to save their plantations from the Union. It wasn't until after they were mistreated, they disbanded, and when they came back into force, okay, they were with the Union. So in a capitalist society, it's kind of capitalism is dictating a lot of the moves, not race. And all free people of color had to have some form of income and resources. So you have to look at that and not put a value judgment on it per se, but understand then how that has played itself out and how that impacts us today, so we can go back and make some corrections to some of this. There was a research done in the Negro Journal of History, Carter G. Woodson, on free people that owned slaves in the 1830s. And it actually lists the families and gives you the names of these slaveholders. So you go back and okay, what was going on in the 1830s, okay, for them to be able to extract that information. That's around the same time with Nat Turner and Virginia and all the things that were going on, tobacco playing itself out, slaves being sent to the South. So you have to look at that.
What is your knowledge, being from Louisiana, and my people were from Louisiana, from Opelousas and then New Orleans, the two main cities. This whole Creole culture, and how did that come about, and like how does that complicate things, in a lot of people's genealogy, especially coming out of the boot, as we would say.
Uh, it's very confusing on a lot of levels because when you do research in Louisiana, you're going to find the term Creole used to mean multiple things. So a lot of times when we're doing surface research, we'll go back and we'll see Creole and we think that means a Black person mixed with French or Spanish. And it's not talking about that. You got to research the author, the time period to understand that in certain instances, that term is being used to describe the first generation of European, French, or Spanish person born in the Americas. Those were their Creoles. We were their possessions in a lot of cases. But technically, it is a mixture when they're referring to Creoles of color. It's usually a combination of French or Spanish parentage on one side. You had to be Catholic. You had to deal with the French or an evolved French Creole culture. And I can't think of what the fifth component is. But it was more than just bloodline for them. And still today, it is a culture unto itself that is different from Blacks who come out of American heritage. For New Orleans, the Creoles were the first to settle. They were the first brought. The American section of New Orleans and slaves brought in that were owned by British planters is the last section to be. So the two histories and the two communities are different. What I know about the relationship between Opelousas and New Orleans is that there was a railroad that ran directly from Opelousas to New Orleans. So a lot of the Black families in St. Landry Parish in that area, okay, you can also find them in the Seven Ward families of New Orleans, because it's natural that if you are going to a place you don't know, you move into a community where people with your culture and who you do know live. So New Orleans is almost like villages. You can almost tell by certain areas of the city where the people who live there originate from. A lot of people who claim Creole ancestry in South Louisiana and think that that ancestry goes back to France or Spain actually goes back to Haiti. Because we have always been going back and forth, other than the main migrations. We have always been going back and forth between Haiti and the southern part, or the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, Galveston, Louisiana, and like that. Because when Haiti won her independence and became a place where any free person or person who wanted freedom could come to live, that transportation went back and forth. You had trade, you had sugar plantations, so you had that trade, commerce going back and forth. And if we were the labor force on land, we were also the labor force on ships. So a lot of that ancestry in those cane fields of South Louisiana is actually people who come out of Haiti with the French or Spanish influence.
Indeed. I remember I forgot the name of the book, but it talks about how, Louisiana in particular was, kind of instrumental because of the going back and forth, the enslaved Africans going back and forth, dealing with the trade upon ships, for bringing the information of the rebellions of Haiti and the revolution and stuff. here to the United States and was passing this information on from plantation to plantation, you know, kind of fueling thoughts and things of that nature. And it's ironic because at least on my father's mother's side, where there's been some extensive knowledge on the genealogy, the farthest we can go back, you know, is a male who comes from Haiti, and all it says on his records is that, you know, father from Africa, but it doesn't say where. But you know that Haiti to, you know, Opelousas is you know, very very real. And speaking of, in terms of limitations, you know, how far back can African Americans on average expect to go in time, you know, in terms of records, if we have those records? Like, how far can we expect realistically for most of us?
You can easily, usually, get back to the 1870s, which is the first census that we appear named. But what happens in research, Bobby, is your research is going to lead you to other research. Once you find things and the information in those things, it's going to send you other places to look. So that's why knowing what resources are out there and how we can find them is our challenge. Because the 1870 census is going to put you in a geographic location. Normally, when we were freed in 1865, most of us did not have the resources to just pack up and move far away. So two things went on. Slaves who had been moved into certain locations and left families other places because they were not allowed to bring their families with them, once they were freed, started to try to find their families. So you have them traveling to past plantations to see if their wives or children can be found. But for those who didn't have resources or a reason to really leave, they settled in land close to the plantations they were enslaved on. You can find that plantation owner listed not far from those slaves that were on this plantation on the census. Once you find him, you can go back 10 years to the 1860 census and research him. Because the census records are going to give you population records, they're going to give you agriculture records and all of that, telling you how many slave cabins, what the crop was, and all these kind of things when blacks were still considered property. That research will then lead you to their archives and genealogical society records, where these are their heroes, and they write extensively about them. Then you have plantation paper collections, where they have the whole collection of his records, the slaves he owned, his successions, and all of that. Those are usually donated to institutions and become part of a larger collection. For Louisiana, there is a collection called the Natchez Trace Collection. That is plantations owners along the Mississippi River. That collection is at the University of Austin in their private library. So that will require, if I needed some information on any of those people, I would have to have time to travel to Austin, stay in Austin, and have access to their library. We don't always have that kind of luxury that we can do that. You have other plantation papers at Tulane, you have it at LSU. It just depended on where that family decided to turn those files in. But within those files are names and bills of sale and everything. Then you have courthouse records that are in clerk of court's offices across the country that will give you usually a conveyance index that lists buyer seller by name. And then that index will tell you a book and page to go to find the actual paperwork or transaction you're looking for. Well, during enslavement, those bill of sales are conveyances of one piece of property to another. So once you found out where your ancestors were kept or who bought them, you can go back into those records and see who the sellers were and most of the transaction. So, like I say, it is the research and your findings that leads you to other places you need to go and look. There is no, I would say, one path to doing the research because all our families have different stories.
And speaking of, I guess the first question would be how does one get started in terms of tracing, their own genealogy? I assume you would start with your immediate family. But from just immediate family, where do we go, saying from there?
To your elders first. And if you live in the same geographic location as your family roots are, it's a little bit easier because we still had griots. We still had some family or some person in the community that knew everybody's business. Okay. But for those who are in other locations now, you try and get in touch with the elders in your family and get as much information from them as you can get and write it down. And a lot of times, the elders, they want to talk about it. They want to talk. They want to have somebody to talk to. So sometimes you have to spend a lot of time just letting them ramble on and on about the good old days and the people they knew and things that happened to extract that information. Once you have that and start to put together your chart, you can kind of see where you need to go next. But that is always the best to get as much information as you can from family members before you start looking for information. And don't think that some of these databases are going to have the information you're looking for. Because a lot of them you go today and it's not there and someone's inputted later and it's there later. But also using the different family search, ancestry, using their databases to try and look for information, but you always have to go deeper. When it comes to the DNA testing, DNA gives us a story, but you still need that paper trail of documents to know the details of that story. The DNA is not going to give you that. And a lot of us don't understand the difference in the results we are getting from different companies. All companies are not answering the same question. So a lot of people aren't clear on what that result is actually saying. I did my matrilineal with African ancestry, and they take you back to the beginnings of your mother's roots. So my mother's, as far as they can go back. Okay. I got a result that says 100% Tuareg Mali. Now, that is not necessarily where those people were when those slave ships came. I have no way of knowing when those people crossed the ocean, into North America. I don't know if that's part of a Native American DNA, or if that's part of an enslavement DNA. Nor do I know where those people originated in East Africa before they migrated thousands of years ago. Because what African ancestry gives you is where that population is today in the 21st century, not where it originates. So you still have a lot of things you have to research that, like I say, it's a paper trail, it's academic research, it's a lot of things to really be able to go back and figure out where did we originate? What people were we back then? And understanding wars and conquest and the fact that people who live in certain places today are not the people who were living there in other periods of time. You know, we run into that with Egypt all the time. Everybody lived in Egypt was an Egyptian, but everybody who lived in Egypt was not the same ethnic group. Because Egyptian is just a nationality, it's not an ethnicity. You know?
Yeah.
And we get that confused with the first Arabs were black. So when you start talking about the Arab slave trade, which Arabs are you talking about? What time period are you talking about? Because back then it wasn't a race thing, it was an ethnicity thing.
Mm-hmm.
But because I like to say that people who have political agendas like to throw out partial facts to prove their political agenda, but that doesn't help a historian who's looking for total facts. If you're trying to unpack the past and what actually happened, you can't get stuck with certain things that have more political implications than they have historical implications.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I tell folks that all the time, and especially on the Egypt question and the relationship between, the different types of possible relationships in terms of, language and culture, more specifically in terms of my research. And, I got to tell people that when I do this research, I automatically have three hypotheses that I have to address. Either the similarities that we see are chance, and, they evolve parallel to each other without any kind of interaction, or two, it was diffusion as a result of interactions, personal interactions, or even interactions with an intermediary. So, for example, culture A interacts with culture B, and they exchange culture facts, but then culture B interacts with culture C, and then they. But you'll see some correlations between culture C and culture A, but they had no historical
Contact.
meetings, saying whatsoever. So you got to keep that in mind when you're doing history, and then you just have stuff to where it is the third hypothesis is that these ideas and expressions are the result of inheritance, meaning that there was a proto culture that existed in the far distant past, and then as over time their descendants, moved and migrated in different directions, but held on to certain aspects of the culture of the parent culture itself. And so, all of these details play a role in how we tell history, and a lot of us kind of miss that based upon exactly what you said, the political, agendas that they have. And so in the academic historical trail, we know that we have to be more precise and more open to, saying judgmental, as you would say, in terms of, what was going on in their reasons at that time. So I appreciate that commentary.
Yeah, if you have the political agenda and spin the facts to fit that agenda, then history really serves us no purpose. Because if you're supposed to be learning the history so you can learn from the mistakes and the successes of the past, you need to know what those facts actually are, not have some kind of emotional or political spin on them because of self-esteem. And that's what I find a lot of us sometimes get caught up in, is trying to prove to other people that we are worthy when we don't. There's nobody we need to prove anything to.
Yep, it is what it is. And I
Yes.
think along with that is also this notion that, of course, well, let me say this, that we we start to value what Europeans value when trying to review our history. So, we look for the warrior societies and anyone who created big kingdoms and things of that nature. But and in that result, we're looking for the people and things that had the prestige of this particular society, who they big up. But we don't understand those weavers, those those agriculturalists, saying those scientists that didn't make a big splash in terms of a large empire, but whose lineages we directly come from regardless, but who have made a major impact in terms of world history, like with the inoculations that we used to do, the types of pedagogy in terms of how we teach, and all of this other kind of, like, all of this stuff is valuable when talking about our particular heritage, and we shouldn't always be looking for buildings or necessarily some long established artworks per se, but that it all, saying, contributes to, the understanding of who we are, and how some of that, pertains to, how we even live and express ourselves, to in this day and age.
Yeah,
But
that's why the
go ahead.
history is so important, Bible, because
Yeah.
when you go back and study ancient Africa and the African kingdoms and all, you come to understand that these societies were not structured at all like European societies. You
Hmm.
come to understand the social structure and how we did things is always usually in opposition to how the European does it. So if you're measuring us by his ruler, you're gonna always come up short
Yeah,
because the things that were of value to the European were not things that were really valued in traditional African societies.
exactly. Matter of fact, I remember this one text. Actually, Dr. Theophilo Benga has a text. I forgot the name of the text. It's a white book. It's one of his more earlier works that came out like in the 70s. And it is simply a translation into English, the like short excerpts from European, uh how should I say, European traders, invaders, the whole gamut, and their first thoughts and their notes about the African societies that they encountered. So these were concentrated mainly in terms of Central Africa, as far as the records that Theophilo Benga picked up. But one of the things that I noticed in reading all of these, for example, is that they always commented on how free the women were and how involved they were in the politics and rulership, in these different societies. And, the nature of, like, in some societies, them building, two-story homes and glass and things of this nature, and these weren't the biggest societies, but it's like that stuff, those records is like the stuff that I think that, we need to highlight in terms of, and I wouldn't say it's just equal in all sense in all societies in terms of gender or whatnot, but, like it was, and you got to think about it like this, that the equality of the women and men in these Central African societies in which they came across was so different and important that they had to document it.
Because they
Like, it
weren't
wasn't
familiar with it.
exactly.
Yeah, it didn't exist in Europe.
Like, it was just that important that they had to document it because it was so foreign, to what was going on, saying in Europe. And so, and a lot of what you talked about, for example, how this permeates into what was going on earlier uh in America, and probably as well in the Caribbean, is this nature of, no orphanages, that
every child had a home, and it took a village to raise a child in a very literal sense. Like
Right.
that culture, came with us and stuck with us here in the United States, and we get exactly what you talked about, earlier.
But
But
see, then too, we had commonality when it came to our value systems. Everybody in the village worshiped the same God, had the same beliefs, obeyed the same laws and all that. So a village could raise that child because
yeah.
that child was going to get the same raising in his parents' house that he would get in the other mother's house. Okay? Today we can't do that because we're trying to unite based on race. But we don't have a standardized culture in place anymore to where I know if my child is at your house, they're going to be under the same values and morals and standards as if they were in my house. So that's how that all broke down for us. And every generation, we seem to be moving further and further away from that when we need to be coming back to it. You made a comment that had to do with our people all wanting to be Native American. On my mom's side, all my life, the oral history is that my grandmother's grandmother is Native American. Now, Mama Timper didn't die till I was in elementary school. I grew up in her house eating her food and watching her and all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Out of her 10 children, none of them can tell you what ethnic group she comes from. For them, I think it was more important to be able to say we Indian than this and that. But not important enough to seek out or hold on to the traditions. And that was always a problem for me. Someone taught me that when you're doing all this digging, you need to look at culture, you look at language, you look at even diseases. Certain diseases came from certain places. If you can trace those diseases migration, you can get back to origins of places. Diseases like rickets that don't even exist anymore. Look at foods and how people prepare the foods. The process is more than the ingredients because our ingredients were based on what we had. But they're cooking processes. They're crafts processes. Blacksmith all throughout my bloodline. The grandmother that was Native American was a quilter. I've never seen anybody that quilts like she quilted. So I've been trying to find out, okay, what people make pocket quilts? Because the way we taught to quilt today is an entirely different process than I watched her quilt. She would make take 2 squares, put them together on 3 sides, stuff it with cotton, sew the 4th side up. When she got enough pockets, she would stitch them together and then put a backing on them. I have not seen anybody teach quilting like that. But that had to have come from somewhere. So the challenge is to try and take all the information you have, look at the history, and be able to put that information into context within that history and a time period and walk it back.
We're wrapping up soon, and I want to ask you how we know, going forward. I mean, excuse me, going backwards, what we need to do or what to expect. But we know that, we're going to hit a wall ultimately here in the United States when it comes to the genealogy. And so what can we do to kind of set this tradition moving forward, with the knowledge of everyone, like taking note of everyone and cousins and things, in the present, and making sure that this information gets passed on from generation to generation, and that they're building on it, as of course people get married and have children and the family tree expands. How can we ensure that whatever knowledge that we are able to capsulate now in customs, continues to move forward and gets passed along.
That family historian has to then look for their successor. And that person has to keep up with family records in the press. Family reunions are a great way to do that, because when people come to the reunion, you just have them fill out the paperwork with the siblings and the children and all of that. But there has to be, and there usually is, Baba, there is usually somebody in these bloodlines that they focus on wanting to keep the records of the family. But that information has to be collected as each new generation comes. My generation on my father's side is the last generation where we all know each other. Our children and grandchildren don't, because the family is so spread out, and we have never been able to pick a place and a time when everybody could come home. So if we did this, we would have to do this, I guess, by email or something like that. But it is, as you're trying to live and survive, you don't always have that culture in place that brings us back together as a whole. And that's important, that we put that back in place so that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren know each other.
Indeed. And I was thinking as well, as an individual who does, software development and web development and things, and the importance of having, copies of things. And because, if you rely on one person having the records, say you live in Northern California right now, and, you have these massive fires. I know that, before I really got interested in, my family's history, the 2005, here comes Katrina, and my grandmother's house that everything was kept in, of course, was damaged, saying by the flood, and all of that stuff is gone. And so I have to find alternative means to get some basic information. And so having to be able, like, if we got photos, to digitize them and put them on the cloud somewhere. So I think, like, part of the process is, it shouldn't be one person, it should be two. One person has
you need duplicate records.
Yeah,
I agree.
And you have the duplicated that just has the backups.
I just don't think we should rely totally on a platform or a method that we're not in control of.
Yeah.
Meaning, the technology is good. The communal storage, I'm not really into, but I think multiple family members should have copies of those records.
Yeah.
Whether we save them on DVDs or whatever the technology is in the future. But we need to have control of our stuff, not rely on other platforms to have it for us.
Indeed.
Okay, because I'm going to tell you, right now, the information that I have access to on the internet is more limited than the information I had 10, 20 years ago when it was being built. They use us to build stuff, and once they get it built, it becomes their database, and they want a subscription for us to see it. But in the early years, this information was, when they were collecting it and putting it together, it was more accessible. Now some records, you can't even find them.
Oh, I should ask this as well: the importance of knowing the difference between an open state and a closed state, and how that affects you being able to search from a distance. or not certain records?
I have not run into any closed states because most of my research has been Louisiana, Virginia, a little bit of Texas, the Carolinas.
Hmm.
And my out of state research is more online than it is in person.
Okay.
Probably a better person to ask that question would be Antoinette
Uh,
because she does a lot of on site research more than I think internet research. Um, a lot of information that is out there for us now is not going to be out there for us in the future. I could tell you that. I've been watching over the past year the state of Louisiana trash microfiche and microfilm readers,
mhm.
destroy microfilm collections because they say this information is not digitized. They no longer need this. But if the input in the digitized collection is incorrect, you will no longer have a hard copy to refer to.
Exactly.
So that in my mind, there's a campaign on to kind of change the narrative. And in the process, a lot of documents and landmarks and all are being destroyed.
Hmm.
Once this process is complete, the narrative on America is going to be a very different narrative than we have today.
So I guess this also plays into why it's important for us to find a way to, create our own institutions where we can store this data. If,
Definitely.
if people are going to, give these records away, that they should give them to these African run institutions with people who are trained to maintain them and things of that nature. Um, that's a discussion for another day. But you know, uh, yeah, it's almost like when I went to Egypt and you see the the Arabs destroying the hieroglyphs off the temples. Like I actually witnessed that. Like they're chipping off. Like what are you? Because they have no sense of history and culture and relatedness to the data. Saying for them they can just this is worthless. We'll do something else with this space.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't want to keep you too long, and I appreciate you again for taking this time out to converse with us. And if anybody wanted to learn more about this process and possibly hire you to help them along their own journey, where would they be able to go to contact you?
I have a Facebook page that is focused totally on African history and our genealogy and its ancestral journey. They can go there and find tons of links and resources for actually doing the research and contact information for me.
Journey. So on Facebook, I don't know the exact link, but as she stated,
That's it.
ancestral journey. If you type that in, that's where you will see.
Send me a friend's request and I'll answer the friend's request. And the database and research goes back to 2013.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it greatly. Do you have any, closing final words that you, want to share that was on your mind that we didn't get to?
No, just thank you for asking me to participate. I'm glad that all of us are finally understanding the importance of genealogy and knowing our past. And knowing now that the DNA is good, but you still need the paper trail and the documents to work out your details and understand your story better.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you everyone for watching and listening. on this Tuesday. You could have been anywhere else, but you chose to be here, and we're very appreciative. As always, please, if you enjoyed this information, like this video and share this video, especially with family and friends. But more importantly, get involved. This is a call to action, conversation that we're having here. So we want everyone to get involved in learning, your own personal history. And I know, especially on this channel, I like to talk all things BC, in terms of Africa, but your recent, family history going back, 20, 50, 100 and 200 years, etc., is just as important. And matter of fact, maybe more important, I would argue, because this is what affects you more immediately and your families to come. And so, document everything, organize it, and you'll be surprised what you discover. In terms of the resiliency of your ancestors, the resourcefulness of those ancestors, the vision and dreams of those ancestors, and even the talents, the creative talent, that you might have some ancestral memory and didn't know where that came from, and things of that nature. So it is very important, this conversation. So I wanted to make sure that before 2020 closed, that while you have some time at home, that this is something that y'all are considering. So again, this is a call to action, and start y'all process of tracing your family lineage. And maybe we'll do a show in the future to see which one of y'all have done and what you've discovered so far from this day, moving forward. And I appreciate everyone for joining the conversation. And so with that said, I don't know when the next show will be, but you can catch me on tomorrow on the Hoppy YouTube channel. Many of y'all may know I was in the documentary film Hoppy, dealing with the Nile River and civilization, of course, but more so the role of economics on the development of civilization. So I had a brief role in there. And so, I promote the film, and on the Hoppy channel tomorrow, we will be talking about the cosmology and the philosophy of the Dogon. So I will be joined. Oh, actually, I will be joined, or I will be joining them more so per se. Dr. Hunter Adams and Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, the wife of Dr. Leonard Jeffries. So I will be on with these two esteemed elders, and we're going to give you all things Dogon. And so y'all check that out. It's going to be at 7 p.m. on the Hoppy, YouTube channel. So just type in Hoppy, film, and their YouTube channel will pop up. So that's going to be 7 p.m. Eastern time, 6 p.m. Central. And with that said, I will talk to you all later, and y'all have a good night. Peace.